know how much gold there is. We know how much gold has been mined at any particular time, and that's where its value comes from. And in the past, in order to stop them just printing money the way the Roman emperors did,
absolutely,
you'd have governments linking their money supply to the amount of gold that they had. That was, broadly speaking, what the gold standard was. And yet, in recent years, particularly since the global financial crisis, as we were discussing earlier in the show, as we seem to discuss every single day on the money, quantitative easing means there seems to be no limit on the amount of money a government or a central bank, Freudian slip there, can create. Not physical notes and coins, but electronic balances. Is that one reason why you think, John, the case for some kind of metallic-based monetary system is becoming more and more relevant?
Absolutely. Look, quantitative easing has failed to deliver on its objectives. We still have a very, very leveraged, unstable economy. Inequality.
Lots of debt.
Absolutely. Inequality is soaring. It can't go on this way, and that which can't go on won't. And if you look at history, you'll see what I call the monetary cycle of history. Countries at various times, you mentioned Rome, there are many other examples, go from good money to bad money, but always back to good money again, sound money, which has almost always and everywhere been gold and silver in some form. Not necessarily actual coins changing hands, but banknotes that are in some way backed, as you say, by gold and silver. We always come back to the same place. And this monetary cycle of history, I think, clearly has turned now back towards a need for sounder money. And think about it from an international point of view. The UK is a huge net debtor to the rest of the world, reliant on foreign capital. The United States is a huge net debtor to the rest of the world, reliant on foreign capital. Someday, some of those foreign investors and countries may want to call in their chips. And when they do, they are going to potentially prefer to accumulate gold rather than to continue accumulating dollar and sterling assets.
Just as an aside, OK, the dollar's the world reserve currency. The US can effectively print hard currency because it is so dominant of the global banking system and also, of course, to the global economy. It strikes me, though, that the Chinese at any moment could just say to the US, hey, we're not going to buy any more of your treasury bills, Uncle Sam. It would take a one-line quote to a journalist like me up on the news wires. I mean, they could seriously mess with US financial markets, given that debt dependence.
I think it's unlikely that they would do that. I think it's extremely unlikely. They don't want to unnecessarily rock the boat. But a good poker player is not going to show their hand. Just knowing, China knowing they potentially could disrupt the international financial system is a potentially sort of veiled threat that they can sort of lift the veil a little bit now and again when it comes to brinksmanship, negotiation with the United States in literally any area of policy.
Now, in a moment, I'm going to ask you about gold as an investment, because quite a lot of viewers may be interested in investing in gold, particularly in these high inflation times, and we can talk about that. But before we get on to that, what would you say, John, if I said to you, the value of gold is because of its scarcity? You know, in previous ancient societies, it has been shells or rocks that are smooth to look like currency, anything that's scarce, and clearly physical currency and central bank money isn't scarce because central banks seem to have gone completely willy-nilly in printing and creating lots more money. But wouldn't gold be a rather primitive form of scarcity when we've got crypto? The whole point of, say, Bitcoin is that there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins mined, because that's what the software behind the cryptocurrency says. That's what the so-called blockchain dictates, because everyone that buys Bitcoin knows that there cannot be more than 21 million ever. Whichever prime minister, politician, the whole world could want there to be 21 million and one Bitcoin, but there never can be, because that's the way the algorithm works. Shouldn't we, in the end, have currency standards linked not to gold, which is quite a random thing and you can mine more gold, but to some kind of crypto system? Does that sound like fantasy economics? I generally believe that is the way the world will go.
Well, I admire this whole push towards crypto. I admire I've read the Bitcoin paper. In fact, I read the original Bitcoin paper many years ago. And I've written about Bitcoin. And I actually love Bitcoin because it forces us to ask the question, what is money? Is it serving society? If not, what can we do about it?
Yeah.
These are good questions.
Yeah.
We should all be asking these questions.
Especially now.
Especially now. It's exactly right. However, gold is, in fact, unique as an element, right? Element number 79. It is uniquely non-reactive, and it is uniquely distinguished from all the other elements.
You're never going to use it for anything other than storing wealth, be it in jewellery or in gold bars, in Fort Knox or
It is
somewhere.
ideally suited for that purpose. In fact, it's so ideally suited, gold has essentially zero entropy. It doesn't corrode, it doesn't decay, and it doesn't matter where in the universe it is, it will still have these properties. Now, crypto may be a very elegant technology that may appear to be an excellent money, and in some respects I think it is, but maintaining the crypto network takes up a hell of a lot more energy, and it will have a lot more entropy to deal with than gold. I think gold's the ideal bedrock. I have no problem stacking and layering crypto value propositions, money substitutes that circulate. I have no problem stacking that on top of gold, but the base layer of money, in my opinion, should be the one with the least entropy. That is gold.
Now, we both know as students of history, and I'm sure quite a lot of our viewers know too, that in the early 70s, the US, Nixon, as we say, closed the gold window. Dollars were no longer directly exchangeable for gold. And then we moved into a world very much of fiat money, whereas it's just bits of paper based on trust. And the notion, the nicety, if you like, that central banks won't totally lose it and just print lots and lots of them. We're now entering a world where the Federal Reserve's balance sheet has increased threefold since the global financial crisis. The central bank of this country's balance sheet has increased 3.5-fold since the global financial crisis. If the Brits and the Americans have basically lost it in terms of how we run a central bank, I mean, that's a pretty serious situation. How do you, as somebody who thinks about this a great deal, how is QE going to end? People ask me this question all the time, and I never really know what to say. So what does John Butler say?
I think ultimately this is going to be a political decision. Let's go back to that decision to close the gold window. Now, how did all this get started? That decision did not happen in a vacuum. That decision happened because beginning from the mid-1960s, the U.S. was fighting an increasingly expensive war in Vietnam, and it was financing President Johnson's Great Society programs. Guns and butter
lots of welfare
is expensive. And so by 1971, the rest of the world, even the UK, called America's bluff and said, we would like some of our gold back, thank you very much. Everyone was doing it. France was doing it. West Germany was doing it. The United Kingdom was doing it. And so Nixon realized he just had no choice in the matter. Okay, then we get into stagflation. Everyone talks about the supply shocks of the 70s, deja vu. Well, guess what? Those supply shocks were largely the oil producers getting together to establish new pricing conventions to protect themselves from the devaluation of the dollar that Nixon unleashed.
OPEC, right?
Exactly.
That was OPEC.
OPEC itself didn't just spring out of a vacuum. That was part of this dollar devaluation.
It was a response to big US spending that worried the rest of the world, worried the US's creditors, countries that had lent the US money or put themselves in the US system by investing in dollars that were essentially backed by gold. So they said, give us some of the gold back. And then Nixon said no.
That's right. Nixon says no, and John Connolly famously says the dollar is our currency and your problem. And the U.S. and the U.S. just went straight ahead, printing through the 70s, ending up eventually in a severe stagflation. But that severe stagflation had its roots in the mid-1960s. The same way the stagflation we're beginning to see here and now has its roots in 2008, and also the excessively loose monetary and credit policies that led into 2008.
So give us the world according to John Butler. So I'm suddenly, I mean, it's never going to happen now, not after this show anyway. I'm suddenly put on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. I bring you in, I have my rise. They eventually appoint me as Governor of the Bank of England. And then you're my main man in from the States. What are we going to do, John? How are we going to change the global system of central banking?
This is what you do. You need to place the world, starting with the UK. Let's set an example for everyone and place it back onto a gold standard. How do you do that? You do that in a way which is the least disruptive way possible, which is the exact opposite of what Churchill did in 1925 when he placed sterling back on the pre-World War I gold standard, but at the 1914 exchange rate.
He said it would be hell, but we got to go back.
That's exactly
right. It's a matter of honour.
But by doing that, by placing gold back at the pre-war parity price in sterling, he totally seized up the economy because it was hugely deflationary to do that. You can't just ignore the millions and millions and billions of sterling that were printed.
And our exports got hammered because suddenly they were massively expensive.
It got so bad that Montague Norman, who was the governor of the Bank of England at the time, he travels to New York to meet with Benjamin Strong, begging and pleading him to ease the credit and liquidity spigot in the United States to relieve the burden on the UK economy. Strong does so in 1927. Guess what happens then between 27 and 29? Huge stock market boom and bust. And the Depression, which started in the UK, crosses the Atlantic to the United States. The Great Depression was caused by massive central bank policy errors. Full stop. Placing the world back onto a gold standard today, but at the current prevailing market clearing price of gold would not be deflationary. It would, however, reset the system. It would require capital to start flowing to where it's actually efficiently used for a change, as opposed to getting stuck in the banking system and simply enabling all forms of asset speculation, which are going to lead to another financial crisis at the rate we're going.
So it's not just about returning to the gold standard, it's the price currency value that you return to the gold standard.
That's right.
So you don't repeat those lessons of history.
Bingo.
Talking of the price of gold, John, what do you think of gold as an investment? Now, since 2016, gold's done well. It's gone from about $1,000 an ounce up to about, $1,750 or something now. But that's only back where it was in 2012. So if you invested in 2012, you got the same amount of dollars per ounce of gold, which means with inflation, you've lost money.
This is true. But look, nothing goes in a straight line. Gold, like anything else that is not itself money, by definition, is going to have some volatility. But take a look at history. Gold's volatility is an upward trend of volatility.
It is.
And I see no reason why, in a world of quantitative easing and chronic fiscal deficits, we're going to see that longer-term trend change. It will keep going and going and going. That said, if I'm correct that the demand function for gold begins to shift in favor of people wanting to hold higher gold balances, that's going to force a much higher gold price because the supply of gold is relatively fixed. Even small shifts in the demand function can have a disproportionate, inelastic impact on the price.
And we know that during the 2010s, gold was at sort of $200-300 for a long time. And we know a lot of central banks, particularly the Russian and Chinese central banks, are buying gold like Billy. John Butler, we've got to leave it there, I'm afraid. We're out of time, but it's great to have you on. And you've brought in your book here, The Golden Revolution Revisited, How to Prepare for the Remonetization of Gold by John Butler. There, the book is up on your screens. John, great to have you with us. I'm sorry we haven't got more time. See, on the money, people who really know what they're talking about. That was John Butler, and there are similar conversations with major players in the world of business, finance, and policy making you can listen to now on my Money Talks podcast on the GB News YouTube channel or via Money Talks podcast on Apple Podcast or any other good podcasting platform. You've been watching On the Money with me, Liam Halligan. Every weekday at 1 p.m, I'll be bringing you your daily dose of economics, business, and consumer news. So join me at 1 p.m. tomorrow or catch up with previous episodes via the GB News app. Thanks for joining me today and see you next time. This is On the Money with me, Liam Halligan. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. We've got more on HGV driver crisis. We're going to have probably more on inflation. And in the run-up to the budget, next Wednesday, the 27th of October, On the Money is going to go to 2 hours every day. You lucky people. Lots of hard work for me, but don't worry, I'll be fine. I'm Liam Halligan. This is GB News, and that was On the Money.
Hello again. Plenty going on with the weather at the moment today. Further heavy, thundery showers, gusty winds as well, but some places not seeing the downpours and actually staying dry and fine. There's another weather system we're watching out in the Atlantic. That will bring more wet and windy weather tonight across the south. This weather front will introduce colder weather for all of us tomorrow. But before then, we've got these thundery showers, this band of heavy rain working its way across northern England and kind of grinding to a halt this afternoon. So a pretty wet day for some here. Further south, we've got showers moving through on a stiff wind with some sunshine in between. Largely dry and bright across southern Scotland and Northern Ireland. And then in the far north, another band of rain. And it's behind that things will be turning colder. But before that arrives, down to the southwest this evening, another area of potentially very heavy rain works in. Overnight, more downpours across the south of England and very windy conditions, particularly for the Channel Islands, potentially disruptive gusts here. That all scoots away overnight, and then we'll start to introduce the colder conditions. So a much chillier night across northern Britain, widely down to single figures. But there will be a strong wind blowing as well, exacerbating that cold feel tomorrow. A lot of cloud early on across the south with some showery rain. That should clear away. We will have some showers across northern Scotland, rain and hail to low levels, some snow over the hills. But for many, actually, tomorrow's a bright day, but it will be cold. Temperatures earlier this week in the high teens. Well, we're looking at single figures to maybe the low teens at best on Thursday. And there will be that brisk wind making it feel chilly, but there will be plenty of sunshine too. Many places staying fine through Thursday evening. Still some showers coming into the north with snow on the hills across northern Scotland. Things looking a little drier for most on Friday, but it will be on the chilly side, and we'll see some wet weather working into western areas during the weekend, but temperatures will be back on the rise.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Good afternoon. It's time to debate the big issues of the day with me, Liam Halligan, and Gloria Di Piero, and a whole host of experts.
Today we're asking, why can't women have a safe night out? That's because there's been a spate of reports of women being drugged in nightclubs, some saying they were spiked by injection.
We'll be hearing from some of the victims, experts, and of course we want to hear from you. But first, here's the GB News headlines with Rosie Wright.
Good afternoon, I'm Rosie Wright. This is your news at 2 o'clock. The Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, is due to hold a news conference this afternoon addressing the rise in the daily number of COVID cases. The government is under pressure to reintroduce restrictions to avoid a winter crisis. The Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation is calling for Plan B, which includes measures like mandatory face masks in public places. Yesterday, the UK recorded its highest daily COVID-related deaths since March. Morocco is banning flights to and from the UK following the rise in COVID cases. The move officially comes into force tomorrow. Authorities have also announced a suspension of flights with Germany and the Netherlands. The Met Commissioner says plainclothes police must now video call uniformed officers when stopping women who are alone. Giving evidence before the London Assembly Police and Crime Committee, Dame Cresta Dick said the Safe Connection initiative will immediately confirm police officers' identity. It comes after PC Wayne Couzens falsely arrested Sarah Everard in March before killing her.
But the onus is on the officer. What was trying to be explained at the press conference was we understand that people may be feeling concerned now. And we, my officers, particularly my male officers, will want to reassure people. And they will go to every length they can to reassure people.
Terrorists who plot to kill multiple people or travel to war zones could face tougher sentences. New guidelines published later will propose a minimum of 14 years in jail. The Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, says the new powers will send a message to those who kill and maim in the name of warped and fanatical ideologies. The move aims to close potential loopholes that allow those convicted of planning attacks to receive shorter sentences. Meanwhile, the House of Commons has been debating the role of social media in providing a platform for terrorism. Here's what was said during Prime Minister's questions.
If we're to get serious about stopping violent attacks, we need to stop online spaces being safe spaces for terrorists. We need to ensure that unaccountable, arrogant social media companies take responsibility for their platforms.
What we're doing is ensuring that we crack down on companies that promote illegal and dangerous content, and we'll be toughening up those provisions. But, Mr. Speaker, what we are also going to do is ensure that the online safety bill does complete its stages before this House.
The Queen has cancelled her trip to Northern Ireland for medical reasons. Buckingham Palace confirmed that Her Majesty has been advised by doctors to rest. The 95-year-old is said to be in good spirits, although disappointed not to carry out the two-day visit that was scheduled to begin today. Newcastle United's head coach, Steve Bruce, has left his position. In a tweet, the football club confirmed the decision was made by mutual consent. It follows the £305 million takeover of the club by a Saudi consortium, which was completed 2 weeks ago. Rising inflation slowed in the UK last month. The annual rate dipped to 3.1% from 3.2% in August. The Office for National Statistics says rising fuel and transport prices were offset by falling restaurant and hotel costs. But the figure is still well above the Bank of England's target rate of 2%.
This is basically a supply inflation. It's not demand. And therefore, we have some right to think it may not be as long as people think. But the more you talk to people, the more they say, look, this isn't going to be all over by the new year. It's going to go on for some significant period of time.
Mary Berry will be made a Dame Commander by the Prince of Wales for a lifetime of cooking, writing and baking. The leading cookery writer and broadcaster has published more than 50 books during a career spanning over 5 decades. She'll be honoured during a ceremony at Windsor Castle. You're right up to date here on GB News. I'll bring you the latest headlines in half an hour. Now back to Gloria and Liam.
And on to Pierre and Halligan today, we're debating the issue of women's safety following a spate of cases where women have had their drinks spiked at nightclubs. And there are also disturbing reports of women being spiked with needles in clubs. So we're asking, why can't women have a safe night out?
And it's not just our guests we want to hear from. Join the debate with your view. Email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews.
That's our main talking point today, women's safety amidst this growing number of cases where women have had their drinks spiked at house parties and nightclubs across the country, particularly students. There are also reports of women being jabbed with needles in clubs.
Nottingham police are questioning a man in relation to a report that a 19-year-old woman was spiked by injection at a nightclub. The Nottingham University student is said to have felt a pinch on the back of her arm before blacking out.
Many women took to social media to report their experience of this. Here's one from a first-year university student who we're keeping anonymous, but whose identity we've verified.
The injections thing is the most recent thing they're now doing, and people are more scared than ever. But the scariest thing to me is how unsurprised we all are. We go out in groups, we refuse drinks, we keep our phones on and in our hands. Girls are wearing denim jackets because the material is harder to pierce. We simply accept the latest horror and come up with new ways to protect ourselves.
So that's the really alarming, shocking view from one student on social media. And joining us now is Niamh Robinson, who's a student at Nottingham University, as well as the editor-in-chief of the university's magazine, The Impact. Niamh, thank you so much for coming on GB News. We're most grateful to you. Are you surprised that we've had reports of young women being spiked in nightclubs, both via their drinks and now with needles? Or is this something that you're hearing about a lot?
Firstly, thank you for having me on the show today. And unfortunately, I have to say, I'm really not surprised at all. This is something which has cropped up again and again, I think largely under the radar. And Impact Magazine, who I work with at the university, have actually been investigating women's safety for a number of months now, because it's something that we realised was a real issue. And now that obviously things have escalated and these spikings are making national news, it just seems to be the next concerning development in an ongoing story, really.
Do you know any women who have been affected by this? If you do, would you tell us their story?
So personally, I can't say I know someone firsthand, but I've had a lot of young women or those identifying as women coming to me and telling me about friends and friends of friends who have had such experiences. One such story was a young woman who went out to a nightclub and she found herself suddenly, very, very unwell. Her friends realized that she was paralytic, and it was very unlikely that this was the result of her own alcohol consumption, as she was very measured with her drinks. And they felt that the response on the part of paramedics perhaps didn't live up to what they had hoped. And it seemed to be, largely on talking about just sort of playing down the situation rather than really dealing with the issue at hand, which was, the fact that women are at risk and we're absolutely terrified. I think the general feeling is that, young women are very scared to go out right now because we just don't know what more we can do to protect ourselves.
We should say, Niamh, that the identity of the young woman whose testimony we read out before, she's not at Nottingham University. You are at Nottingham University. To what extent do you think universities are responsible? If you and your mates, you go out into the city where your university happens to be based, you're at a nightclub that's nothing to do with the university, while the university can provide, routine pastoral care and so on, isn't it down to the nightclub owners, their security, rather than the university authorities to protect you when you're in a nightclub?
In all honesty, I think it should be a collaborative effort. Whilst we're at university, we're under the care of the university institution, and I completely understand that nightclubs in town are outside of their remit, but the university is actually working closely with Nottinghamshire Police. They have taken it as a very serious concern and as their responsibility, and I believe that that's rightly so. This is not an issue that's going to be solved by one institution alone, by just the nightclub owners, adding more bouncers on the door or upping their search measures. This is a systemic, genuine issue which needs to start at the grassroots level with educating individuals within universities and then hoping that those attitude changes lead to less women and those identifying as women being at risk in the clubs on nights out.
Sarah Crew, who is the National Police Chiefs Council lead for rape and adult sexual offences, has told MPs today that plainclothes police officers are likely to be deployed in nightclubs to combat this new form of spiking. That's welcome, surely.
I mean, I think there are mixed feelings at the university about this, in all honesty. Obviously, in the wake of the Sarah Everard case, I think a lot of young women do feel that the police aren't always their friend. And that's a really upsetting thought, because obviously the natural reaction should be, yes, we would feel far more protected.
We've lost her there.
What a shame there. We lost Neve Robinson, a student at Nottingham University. She's editor-in-chief of Impact Student Magazine. I'm sorry we've lost your sound and vision, Neve, but you spoke extremely well and we're most grateful for your contribution. Joining us on the show now is author and former independent advisor to the government, Emily Hunt, and political editor at The Mirror, Pippa Crerar. Thank you both for joining us. Pippa, your paper has been reporting on a case today, Tell us about that.
So this was the case of Zara Owens, who was, like many of your viewers and our readers, was a young woman student who had gone to a nightclub. And like young women across the board in these situations, unfortunately, took great care that her drink wasn't spiked. Not accepting drinks from strangers, covering drinks, all the sort of things, unfortunately, that we're all too used to doing. But then was injected with the drug instead, and suddenly came over all woozy, and fortunately was in a position where her friends were able to scoop her up outside and take her home. But then when she woke up the next day, noticed that there was sort of a sore mark on her leg, and she'd actually been injected with some drug, but then struggled to be able to sort of report that to police and the authorities. Obviously, with the added concerns beyond the initial spiking were then whether the needle was clean and whether she could be in a vulnerable position as a result of that. So clearly was concerned about needing some medical attention. A really horrific story. And on the back of, obviously we've all been talking about this over the last 24 hours, and on the back of this, I opened up my Twitter DMs and to readers and suggested that if people wanted to share their stories, they could get in touch. And I'm afraid to say there's been huge numbers of people coming forward, lots, as you might expect, with stories of themselves or their friends having their drinks spiked. It's a long time since I was at university or, going out clubs regularly, but this is something that's been going on for a very, very long time. And it's just really, frankly, depressing that the situation there hasn't got any better. But more worryingly, there was also examples of this new phenomenon where people had been injected with some drug or other. And it's this sort of new phenomenon, which is, I think, really making young women much more fearful. You kind of are used to all the old threats. That's not to say that they should exist or that we shouldn't challenge them, but this seems so difficult for somebody to protect themselves against. It's obviously shouldn't be on women to protect themselves. It should be on the perpetrators not to do it. But obviously it's extremely alarming for lots of these people. And I have to say I'm quite shocked by the number of people that got in touch with their own stories about this.
Emily Hunt, we just heard from Neve Robinson, a young student journalist at Nottingham University. She said her university and the police are taking a collaborative approach to this, to reports and instances of students being jabbed with syringes in nightclubs. What would you be asking the government to do as a former government advisor? How should ministers be responding to an issue which really has caused alarm, as Pippa Crerar says, in the last 24 hours?
So I should probably clarify, I am still an independent advisor to the government on sexual violence. So can't really speak to what I would say to ministers. But as a victim of what I believe was a drug-facilitated sexual attack, I can completely understand where people are coming from. So I believed that I was drugged, and unfortunately the police didn't take that seriously, and toxicology wasn't done fast enough. because most of these drugs metabolize out of the system in 6 to 12 hours. So quite literally 83% of the time, the drugs are gone in 6 to 12 hours. So particularly with a smaller woman with fast metabolism, you're on a very fast timeline to prove that anything has happened. Because I wanted to know if what happened to me happened to lots of people, I actually had a survey done. My background was in political research, so it seemed sensible at the time. And unfortunately, what I found is that 51% of women 18 to 24 either have been drugged or know someone who's been drugged for the purpose of sexual assault. And that is just drink spiking as opposed to this new trend towards actual essentially stabbing somebody with a syringe, which I read about this morning as well and was just deeply horrified of.
Pippa, just thinking about what demands we can practically make. I mean, what is this drug? How do people get hold of it? Can they be stopped from getting hold of it? Is that a practical way forward, perhaps, Pippa?
Well, I think the Home Office are obviously going to have to look at this in more detail. Priti Patel has already suggested this morning that she's consulting with police about the scale of the problem, which anecdotally seems worryingly widespread. But of course, they will have a better. Well, you'd hope they'd have a better view of how effective it is. Although as others rightly point out, the police, first of all, women don't always go to the police with these. About these incidents, and secondly, if they do, they're not always taken seriously, unfortunately. But it probably has to go broader than that. It can't just be about Priti Patel saying to the police, "Come on, guys, you need to do it better on this." It probably needs to be some sort of like convening of venue owners, sort of industry bodies, of universities, not exclusively of all these young women at university, but lots of them seem to be. And certainly lots of the replies that I was getting last night seemed to be from students who felt that their own universities weren't doing enough to make not only women aware, but men aware of the risk, but also of the potential, the trouble they could get into, what they faced in terms of I think I've lost you. I'm not sure if I have.
No, carry on.
Yeah, you're still there. Sorry, my screen went blank there for a minute. But in terms of the charges they might face if they ended up being perpetrators in these incidents. So the venues, the universities, women's groups, and the police probably all need to sit down together and try and work out exactly the answers to the sort of questions you're mentioning there, Gloria. What is this? What are these materials? How are these drugs? How are people getting hold of them? Is it something that's easily accessible to anybody going into a chemist or can produce themselves, or is it something that's actually on the black market and therefore outlawed? I think the honest answer to that question is we probably don't know, but one would imagine that they're not impossible to get hold of. But if what routes are they coming in? Are they getting them from the internet? And if so, is that something you can crack down on with the support of big firms online? So there's not much. It's a new phenomenon, it seems like, and terrifying one. And because we don't know enough about it, I think really the onus has to be initially on fact finding and bringing together all those individuals. So hopefully that's what we'll see in the coming days from the government.
Emily, I'm no lawyer. Pippa just mentioned charges there. It strikes me that we're going to, as and when people guilty of injecting young women in nightclubs are arrested and charged, it strikes me there needs to be some really stiff sentences. It seems to me beyond assault, it seems to me to be grievous bodily harm if you are injecting somebody against their will without even their knowledge with a substance which could potentially harm them. This is not banter. This is not jolly japes. Yeah. Surely there needs to be custodial sentences, even if the people involved, the men involved, and you can only assume it's going to be almost entirely men who are doing this, even if they're relatively young and relatively inexperienced.
So I think it's really important that we reflect on literally the first thing I thought this morning when I read this story, which is we need to be prosecuting rapists, right? That's where we start. We are not really imagining that people are drugging women, whether through syringe or drink, just to do it. We're all pretty much expecting that it's for the purpose of drug-assisted sexual assault. Unfortunately, we still have a 1.6% charge rate for rape. So right now, we have men out there who have no deterrent, essentially, on committing rape. And in previous studies, we've seen that over 30% of university-aged men would have sex with somebody against their will, as long as they knew there would never be a consequence. And I absolutely feel like the story this morning is showing what happens when we do not prosecute rape and there is no deterrent. Because you're right, right now, the people who are out there doing this think that there will be no consequence. And unfortunately, right now, we're showing them that they're right. And what we need to do as a society is have some really big conversations with the people around us that starts with, actually, is it really okay to get the double shot in the gin and tonic when a girl asks for one shot? That's where we start. It's okay to try to get somebody a bit drunk to loosen them up. That's how Friday night banter goes. Well, then the next step on that path is putting a drug in somebody's drink. And then the next step on that path is what we're seeing now. We need to stop this path at the beginning and be having conversations with the people around us about what consent is, because people are going down this path slowly. You're not waking up one morning and deciding to stick a syringe in someone. You're starting somewhere else. And we absolutely need to be prosecuting rape in order to keep people from thinking that there will be no consequence.
Pippa, we're, I don't know, roughly the same age. And you think as a woman that as times advance, then things advance for women. But when I'm sure you had nights out when in your, late teens, 20s, we all did. At no point, I'd worry about getting home safely, making sure there was a minicab or a taxi. But at no point did I worry about what was going to happen to me when I was in that club or pub, whether or not somebody was going to drug me. How has our culture got worse?
Well, I think there was some evidence of drink spiking when I was around at uni, but it certainly wasn't as widespread as it seems to be now. I mean, the statistics there about, half of people knowing somebody that had been drugged are really astonishing. I mean, it was a rarity when I was in my late teens and early 20s, albeit an awful one. I think this is a really big question, isn't it? And so much of it comes down to education and exposure. And I don't just mean education in the classroom, I mean education from your peers, and particularly if you're a boy, but also how they interact with their female peers, and also at home with your families. And, it's men, it's boys and men, ultimately, they need to step up on this. But also exposure. And the second, but by that I mean, what people see online, what becomes acceptable, the sort of depersonalization of women, whether it's through pornography or whether it's through sort of anonymity on social media accounts, and the abuse that it's easier to throw at somebody that's just a name on a Twitter account than you would ever consider in person. And it's slippery slope you mentioned, isn't it? It's the path. It's like, it's okay, people start by being rude about someone they don't know on Facebook or Twitter, and then it sort of, it gradually escalates. That's not to say, of course, that every sort of abusive comment online ends up in a sort of a real life incident. But if you don't call it out early, I very strongly believe that those individuals that might go down that route feel that they can do so without, they can do so without any sort of challenge. And that comes back to the debate that's also being had in this place in the Commons at the moment about misogyny and whether it should become a hate crime. And I know that lots of people think, well, why, God, you spoil sports. Why should you stop a builder having fun shouting, "Oh, I love, how's it, cheer up, love," or like nice skirt, nice legs, whatever, as you're walking down the street? Fine. But think about how it makes that individual feel. And actually, if that sort of personal commentary is tolerated, then what comes next? Does it mean that they feel okay, that it's okay to touch somebody when they're in a nightclub, to grind up against them when they're dancing? I mean, I'm not saying, of course, I'm not saying that you can stop people. You should necessarily stop people complimenting or learning through discussion with friends and colleagues what's acceptable and what's not. But I do think that clearly our young men need some more guidance, and that has to be done through sort of sensitive educating and thinking about what they're exposed to online.
Pippa Crerar, political editor of The Mirror, and Emily Hunt, author and independent advisor to the government. Thanks for your contribution to a very, very important discussion, and a discussion that certainly Gloria and I and all of us here at GB News are determined will continue in the weeks and months ahead.
Remember to join the discussion. Email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us @GBNews. We'll read out some of your thoughts later in the programme.
Up next, a report on how an Afghan family's been reunited in Coventry after fleeing the Taliban. But just before that, It's time for your weather forecast.
Hello again. Another night of wet and windy weather across parts of the south. There's a Met Office yellow warning in place, some very heavy rain and some gusty conditions. Strongest winds likely over the Channel Isles and northern France. In fact, this area of low pressure has been named by Météo France, the French meteorological organisation, because we're going to see potentially some damaging winds here. Across southern parts of England, it's more the heavy rain that's cause for concern. Several hours of heavy rain could cause some flooding and some travel disruption, but it will still also be pretty windy along the south coast before that all tends to scoot away before dawn. There's some patchy rain over northern England, sinking southwards, and some showers over northern Scotland that will be falling as snow over the hills, hail and rain to low levels as things turn colder. A much chillier start to Thursday. Quite cloudy to begin with across southern England and South Wales. Some rain across the southwest, but that should clear away. And for many, Thursday's a bright, fine day with quite a bit of blue sky and sunshine. There will be some showers keeping going over northern Scotland, still with snow on the hills, hail and rain to low levels, and some rain showers at times for North Wales, northwest England and Northern Ireland. A colder feel as well, certainly compared to earlier in the week, despite the sunshine, a really chilly wind blowing. That wind will continue to ease down through the afternoon and evening. We'll keep some showers over northern and western Scotland, the odd one for Northern Ireland and northwest England as we head into Friday. And that theme continues into Friday too. Much of southern England, eastern England will stay dry. A drier day for northeast Scotland as well. Still a chilly wind blowing, but that wind will be lighter for many during Friday compared to Thursday. Still a few showers for North Wales, northwest England and western Scotland. Into the weekends, many places start dry and chilly, slowly turning milder with some patchy rain here and there by Sunday.
Join me, Nana Akweer, on Fridays, Saturdays and Sunday afternoons here on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as my panel and I take on some of the top stories hitting the headlines.
You can look up the statistics.
No, you look it up. I hug everyone.
We learn from it and try and move on. That's it.
Opinion is at the heart of the show. It's a place for open and frank conversation, but without the fear of cancellation. So join me here on GB News on Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoons between 4 and 6 p.m.
Welcome back. We've been talking about women's safety following a growing number of cases in which women have had their drinks spiked in nightclubs.
We'll be returning to that really important discussion later in the programme, so you can continue to get in touch with us. Send your views to gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us @gbnews.
Now, a former Afghan-British military interpreter from Coventry has been reunited with his family, who have managed to come to the UK following the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan.
Jamal Barak has lived here since 2015, but has spent months fearing for the safety of his family in Kabul. Now, thanks to the help of the British authorities, his parents and 4 siblings have been safely brought to the UK. Our West Midlands reporter, Balvinder Sidhu, has been following this story since July and brings us this update.
For Jamal Barak, who is a former British military interpreter from Afghanistan, who's been living in Coventry for about 7 years, it was an emotional moment when he was finally reunited with his father, mother and 4 brothers. His father has served as a gardener for the British forces in Helmand province for many years, so the family were eligible for the Afghan relocation programme. But Jamal was obviously very concerned about their safety when the Taliban took over. But he finally got to see them on Saturday, and he says it was an incredibly emotional moment.
We were crying when we hugged each other, and that was such a long time we didn't see each other, and we never thought we will get together back, because I can't go back to Afghanistan, and then they never thought that they're going to come to the UK.
Well, the journey wasn't easy. The family had to be safely evacuated from Afghanistan via Pakistan. They were taken to Islamabad airport, where they flew into Cyprus, and then they arrived at RAF Brize Norton on Friday on a military flight. They are currently staying in a hotel. They've been told to quarantine, although they have come from an amber list country. So they're staying in a hotel while the authorities look for appropriate accommodation for them.
They were in Pakistan for nearly 5 weeks. And then the British High Commission, they helped them there, and then which they finally arrived by the Royal Air Forces.
Jamal was an interpreter for the British Army who was resettled in the UK a few years ago. Jamal's father worked for the British Army in the military headquarters. I mean, this is a family that gave everything to support us. Jamal's brother was shot and very badly wounded by the Taliban a number of years ago. Jamal's father was denied the right to resettle in the United Kingdom earlier this year under the new Afghan relocation scheme. And this is how I came to hear of it. Thankfully, the Secretary of State for Defence, during the evacuation, reviewed Jamal's father's case, Shaista's case, and granted him eligibility. I met up with Jamal when I was last in the UK in late August and early September, and we talked about how we could help his father, to get to Islamabad for relocation. And as Jamal will have told you, that's exactly what's happened. I mean, it's a remarkable story of courage and initiative and great dedication.
Unfortunately, it's not all good news. Jamal Barak says his brother was left behind because he says the Home Office is saying he's over 18, so he's not a dependent, although he did work as a interpreter, but for a private company. He is now calling on officials to help bring his brother back safely to the UK.
The MOD, when they given the eligibility to my father, they said, you're able to come to the UK, but you cannot bring your son, which is called Mahmoud, is over 18. But they left him behind, and my father had to leave him behind. Sure, they're happy, they're very happy, but when you look at the back in Afghanistan, my dad left his son behind, and he's disabled because the Taliban shot him.
Jamal says he's extremely grateful to the British government, journalists and former army officials who have been supporting him to bring his family over. Jamal says it's not over yet, though. He wants to help any other eligible former British military interpreters to be assisted to a safe country. He says there are still a number that were left behind when the US and the UK left Afghanistan.
We contacted the Home Office about Jamal's brother, who was left behind in Afghanistan, and they've said they continue to support people who are eligible for relocation but cannot comment on individual cases. However, those who were rejected are welcome to reapply with new evidence.
Right after this break, it's all about your opinion. Join the discussion. Why can't women have a safe night out? Next on De Piero and Halligan. But first, it's the GB News headlines with Rosie Wright.
Good afternoon, I'm Rosie Wright. Here are the latest headlines. The Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, is due to hold a news conference this afternoon addressing the rise in daily new COVID cases. The government is under pressure to reintroduce restrictions to avoid a winter crisis. The chief executive of the NHS Confederation is calling for Plan B, which includes measures like mandatory face masks in public places. Morocco is banning flights to and from the UK following a rise in COVID cases. Authorities have also announced the suspension of flights with Germany and the Netherlands. The move officially comes into force tomorrow. The Met Commissioner says plainclothes police officers must now video call uniformed officers when stopping women who are out alone. Giving evidence before the London Assembly Police and Crime Committee, Dame Cresta Dick said the Safe Connection initiative will immediately confirm an officer's identity. It comes after PC Wayne Couzens falsely arrested Sarah Everard in March before killing her. The Queen has cancelled her trip to Northern Ireland for medical reasons. Buckingham Palace confirmed that Her Majesty had been advised by doctors to rest. The 95-year-old is said to be in good spirits, although disappointed not to carry out the two-day visit that was scheduled to begin today. Steve Bruce has left his job as Newcastle United manager. In a tweet, the football club confirmed the decision was made by mutual consent. It follows the club's £305 million takeover by a Saudi consortium, which was completed 2 weeks ago. You're up to date here on GB News. I'll be back in half an hour, but now back to Gloria and Liam.
Welcome back. We're talking about women's safety because of a recent spate of cases in which women have had their drinks spiked at nightclubs or house parties. It's also disturbing reports of women being spiked by injection in clubs. So how do we keep women safe on a night out? It's not really their responsibility, is it?
Joining us on the show is the Police and Crime Commissioner for Surrey, Lisa Townsend, and the CEO of the Nighttime Industries Association, Michael Kill. Lisa, over the last 24, 48 hours, this story has really caused huge alarm. Perhaps we've been late to the story. Perhaps this has been happening for a while. But the idea of young women students and young women from all parts of society being injected in nightclubs, how should the police respond to this?
Thanks, Liam. I agree. I think you're absolutely right. This is something that's been going on for a very long time. I haven't been a student for a very long time, for over 20 years now. And it happened to me. My drink was spiked and I was brushed off when it happened. I admit that I didn't report it to the police, but I did report it to the club at the time after it had happened and after I realised what was happened and was told that nothing like that could possibly happen in their bar. And it must have been a dodgy batch of alcohol. They were more prepared to own up to a potentially dodgy batch of vodka than they were to the fact that somebody might have spiked my drink. We have moved on, but I will say that this is something that women have been talking about, and I'm sure Gloria will. But this is something we've known about for an awfully long time. But I'm really glad that what we're now doing and what you're doing is having this conversation and asking how do we all help address it? Because of course that's the thing. It's not on women to do it, and it's on all of us. It's on the police. I've got male friends saying to me in the general sort of arena of how do we help women feel safer and girls feel safer, and there are all kinds of ways that we can do it, the police can do it, and one of them is of course taking it seriously, whether you're a friend who's been told it, whether you're a bar or nightclub that's been told it's happened in your venue, or whether you're the police. And I know that certainly in Surrey the police do take this very, very seriously. We've had a small number of incidents reported recently about drinks being spiked. We haven't had any, thankfully, of the needle incidents reported in Surrey, but the police do take the issue incredibly seriously.
Lisa, thank you for being so open and sharing your own experience. Michael, Lisa suggested that things have moved on since being brushed off by the nightclub and saying nothing like that would happen here. Have they?
Well, very much so. I mean, I'll back up what Lisa's saying here. I mean, we're extremely concerned to learn of the increases that we've seen in the number of spikings, and specifically the instance involving needle prick situations as well. It's hugely concerning for us. But without a doubt, we have moved on. The training, the professionalism of security, the fact that they go through a huge process of looking at the likes of first aid and duty of care training, not only internally but externally during licensing. And we are very, very much more aware of the challenges around vulnerability. And there is a huge focus, although this has been going on for some time in isolated cases across the country, it's without a doubt important to have this discussion. And it's why we're calling for the Home Office to engage in an inquiry and really sort of understand where the issues are, engage with the industry, engage with some of the people that have had these experiences, these terrible experiences, and really start to get to the basis of this and try to deal with the societal issue collaboratively, both from an industry perspective, but also from a community perspective within each of the cities up and down the country.
Michael, aren't we reaching the point where, without wishing to kill the vibe as you go into a nightclub, a quick search of people for not just firearms and knives as you'd expect, but also for syringes, isn't that a price worth paying so women feel safe?
Well, without a doubt. I mean, there are absolute safety protocols that are put in place. Part of our licensing is to protect public safety. And we work very, very hard with many protocols and initiatives. We work very closely with the police and key stakeholders, and we're scrutinised regularly over incidents or crimes that emanate from premises that are licensed. So we are probably one of the most heavily sort of regulated environments. And for us, I mean, the challenge that we have is we are doing an immense amount of work in the background in terms of communication, in terms of speaking to our customers, training our staff, ensuring that our security staff are licensed and trained. We have duty of care policies. But it's like you say, there is a collective approach to this that needs to be looked at. And, while we appreciate all of these things that we're putting forward, we've still got some challenges that still exist. And for us, we're keen to work with those key stakeholders to move things forward and try to get to a point where we can reduce or minimise this situation as best as possible. It's a huge challenge, but we do need to understand from a policing perspective and from a community perspective the brave women that have stepped forward and shared these experiences, exactly the scenarios so that we can deal with them head on.
Back to you, Lisa. Sarah Crew, who is the National Police Chiefs Council lead for rape and adult sexual offences, has been speaking to MPs today. She is also the police chief in Avon and Somerset. And she said that she's only become aware of physical spike injections this morning, but told MPs that drinks spiking was a big problem in Avon and Somerset, where 2 people have been charged with the events in the past fortnight. Tell us about your area, Lisa. Are you aware of how widespread a problem it is in your area?
Yeah, well, in Surrey, we've had a couple of reports quite recently as well, actually, in the issue in the area of Reigate in Surrey, where reports have been made. And I know the police are working very closely with the venue in question there in order to find out exactly what happened. And part of the problem, of course, is evidence gathering when it happens. Now, I know certainly one of the reasons that I didn't report my own case years ago was because I think women are very aware that the evidence disappears very quickly. They are using, drugs are often used in these cases because it disappears so quickly. So gathering evidence is very difficult. It's one of the reasons why women really must report it as soon as possible. But yeah, it is an issue in Surrey. I believe it's an issue absolutely everywhere. And that is why it's so important that we all tackle it. And it's great to hear Michael talking about nightclubs and bars and the nighttime economy. And of course they are regulated. But what I would say is that it is, of course, much bigger than that. And regulation alone is not going to solve this. We will not police our way out of this problem. It is a wider societal problem. And I would call on all men as well, whenever they hear of anything, whether it's a friend or whoever it is saying something that suggests that this kind of behaviour is remotely acceptable, challenge them on it. We must move away from this situation where it's considered shameful for women to be drinking in a club or to have had a few drinks or to be, intoxicated. And we must move to a place where it is shameful for men to even be discussing this, let alone thinking that this behaviour is okay or carrying it out.
Lisa, earlier in the show, we talked to Niamh Robinson, a very impressive young student journalist from Nottingham University, and we put forward to her the scenario where plainclothes police were in nightclubs trying to monitor spikings, jabbings, and so on. And she said there might be mixed feelings about that, not least in light of the Sarah Everard case and so on. Clearly, the police do have a job of work to do to reassure students if they are going to be in their midst in these social situations where we want to protect our young women.
Absolutely. And of course, we want our police to be in the places where we feel vulnerable or where we might be vulnerable. I'm not sure that plainclothes police officers in clubs and bars is necessarily the right idea or the answer. As I said, it's great to hear Michael talking about the work that the industry is doing. But really, I think that in those situations, what's important is that those in the industry, those employees are absolutely aware of what's going on, because they will be the eyes and ears. Our friends when we're out will be the eyes and ears. But I want to see the industry itself really take an incredibly proactive lead on this in terms of looking out for the signs, understanding what the signs are, and so that women feel comfortable not just approaching the police and reporting it, but approaching a member of bar staff and saying, I think there's something wrong here, or I've seen something I'm not quite happy about. And I'd like to see really the industry helping to police itself rather than putting plainclothes police officers in bars and clubs.
Michael, what do you make of the National Police Chiefs Council lead for rape and adult sexual offences saying today that plainclothes police officers are likely to be deployed in nightclubs to combat this new form of spiking?
I think we've gone through this when we discussed the Sarah Everard position. I mean, we are working extremely hard. We've seen some great pieces come out of Devon and Cornwall with regard to spiking testing pilots, which have worked very well and have definitely de-escalated and left many people feeling much safer when they have their concerns. We're continually battling the training regime to make sure that staff, although high turnover, are completely aware of the signs and how to identify reporting channels, etc. But the other thing which I think is vitally important is we really need to recognise and focus on the perpetrators, people that are doing these heinous crimes, and we have to employ a status of ensuring that we don't have conscious bystanders. We need people to be proactive and as a community deal with this alongside the industry, alongside society, within regions and on a national basis. And I completely agree that there is a lot of work to do. But we need to focus on the perpetrator. The bravery of some of these women that are stepping forward, that have engaged and have been gone through these experiences, I think we've got to applaud. And I would welcome them coming forward to speak about these experiences so they can really get to the bottom and understand exactly how these things are happening, and we can deal with it collectively as a community, as a society moving forward.
Lisa, Michael talked about the perpetrators there. I'm not a lawyer, but surely, to spike somebody against their will in a way that tricks them, even if it doesn't lead to any kind of sexual assault, it strikes me that that's grievous bodily harm. It strikes me that is a very, very serious offence. Even if you are a relatively young student, and you can try and dismiss it in your own mind as banter and horseplay and a bit of a laugh. Surely we've got to be looking at custodial sentences. If you inject somebody with something that could harm them against their will.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an incredibly serious offence, and spiking somebody's drink can get you up to 10 years in prison alone, and that's before any other offences have been shown to be committed. So, if there is anybody out there that thinks this is just a prank or a joke or something that doesn't have any lasting effects, I can assure you it will absolutely have a lasting effect on a perpetrator. And Michael's absolutely right; it is the perpetrators that of course we must focus on. So, if any 18, 19-year-old going out to a club or a bar this weekend thinks that that's going to be acceptable, then they're looking at a potential criminal conviction, which will stay on their record. Of course, make it, you can do your 3 years in university and you can get a fantastic degree, but if you've got that on your criminal record and you're spending time in prison, then no degree is going to help when it comes to the employment market. So it is incredibly serious, and I don't want anybody to think that it isn't. And then, of course, you've got the effects, on the woman. It's something, as I said, 20 years ago, I still remember it very well. So there are psychological effects, and I was very lucky. I made it home with friends at the end of the evening, and there were no lasting effects. But there is a psychological effect there, part of which is making women, making women scared to go out and do the things that we should all be able to do.
Indeed, Lisa. Michael, with that in mind, it's not surprising that students are planning to boycott clubs as part of calls for more to be done to tackle the epidemic in spiking. Girls' night in groups in cities across the UK have been formed.
Yeah, and I've seen many of these groups sort of pop up. I mean, we are very keen to sort of work collectively to deal with this issue. Without a doubt, we have seen on a regional and a national basis the step up of protocols and initiatives to look to put barriers in place in terms of drink spiking, in terms of stepping up searching, and many of the sort of the base level protocols that we would put in place normally. But we are, without a doubt, more vigilant, and we are expressing some very clear guidelines collectively across trade bodies to ensure that people are aware of what they need to look out for, and to make sure that we are stepping up our communication strategy to educate ladies coming out, but also to educate perpetrators that this will be seen as a serious crime and the police will be involved immediately to move across. But the key thing is as was suggested, we need to ensure we can secure evidence and we convict these people so that they're aware, and the message is then very clear moving forward. But we are working hard in the background with key stakeholders, with the police, to ensure that we've got the protocols in place for the coming weekend and the current trading period, because we absolutely want people to understand that they can come and enjoy a safe night out and not fear coming into the nighttime economy.
We appreciate your time talking to us, Michael. Michael Kildare, the CEO of the Nighttime Industries Association. And thank you also to Lisa Townsend, Police and Crime Commissioner for Surrey. An important conversation.
You've been messaging us with your thoughts on this hugely important issue. Sadie says, as a final year student, I've not had one safe night out in the university city I live in. This is why I made the decision in my first year to move back home. My university always has safety measures, but they can't be everywhere at once when there are multiple clubs in the city I go to uni in as well.
David says, caught with such drugs and equipment should be charged with going equipped to commit a sexual offence, and a minimum sentence, says David, applied of 5 years with no parole.
Warren says this isn't just the case for women, this happens to men as well.
Howard says, Liam, I wholeheartedly agree that these needle incidents themselves are of grievous bodily harm and alone should have outcomes of severe prison sentences. They should be tackled now. This is outrageous. The question of low prosecution of rapes is another issue to be tackled immediately.
And we thank you for spending your time with us, for taking part in the conversation today. You've been watching De Piero and Halligan on GB News. I'm going to Spain for a few days.
Oh, she's leaving me again! God.
Thanks for being with us. He'll be back
Tom
tomorrow.
Harwood, here he comes with your daily dose of political news. Thanks for being with us.
Hello again. Another night of wet and windy weather across parts of the south. There's a Met Office yellow warning in place, some very heavy rain and some gusty conditions. Strongest winds likely over the Channel Isles and northern France. In fact, this area of low pressure has been named by Météo France, the French meteorological organisation, because we're going to see potentially some damaging winds here. Across southern parts of England, it's more the heavy rain that's cause for concern. Several hours of heavy rain could cause some flooding and some travel disruption, but it will still also be pretty windy along the south coast before that all tends to scoot away before dawn. There's some patchy rain over northern England, sinking southwards, and some showers over northern Scotland that will be falling as snow over the hills, hail and rain to low levels as things turn colder. A much chillier start to Thursday. Quite cloudy to begin with across southern England and South Wales. Some rain across the southwest, but that should clear away. And for many, Thursday's a bright, fine day with quite a bit of blue sky and sunshine. There will be some showers keeping going over northern Scotland, still with snow on the hills, hail and rain to low levels, and some rain showers at times for North Wales, northwest England and Northern Ireland. A colder feel as well, certainly compared to earlier in the week, despite the sunshine, a really chilly wind blowing. That wind will continue to ease down through the afternoon and evening. We'll keep some showers over northern and western Scotland, the odd one for Northern Ireland and northwest England as we head into Friday. And that theme continues into Friday too. Much of southern England, eastern England will stay dry. A drier day for northeast Scotland as well. Still a chilly wind blowing, but that wind will be lighter for many during Friday compared to Thursday. Still a few showers for North Wales, northwest England and western Scotland. Into the weekends, many places start dry and chilly, slowly turning milder with some patchy rain here and there by Sunday.
Hi, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
And we're hosting a show right here on GB News, 9:30am till 12pm, every single weekday, called To The Point.
We're going to be talking about all the big issues that matter to you at home in Britain.
Absolutely, whether it's holding politicians to account, discussing what's taking place in the Channel, banging on about law and order, we're not afraid to do the absolute lot of it.
Yes, and if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we'll be saying it.
Make sure you're here 9:30am till 12pm, every single weekday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
Hello and welcome to The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. Coming up on this hour, did Trump's former campaign manager Steve Bannon incite violence? And should he go to jail? Or is he facing a politically motivated attack? Well, we'll speak to the president's former chief spokesman, President Trump, that is. And the Coronavirus Act has been extended for another 6 months, but without a formal vote in Parliament. But what is the reason the government will retain its draconian lockdown powers? We'll speak to the leader of the COVID recovery group of MPs. And should terrorists get more time in jail for just planning attacks? Dominic Raab, the Justice Secretary, has said so. We'll bring you all the latest right after your news with Rosie Wright.
Good afternoon, I'm Rosie Wright. This is your news at 3 o'clock. The Health Secretary Sajid Javid is due to hold a news conference this afternoon addressing the rise in new daily COVID cases. The government is under pressure to reintroduce restrictions to avoid a winter crisis. The Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation is calling for Plan B, which includes measures like mandatory face masks in public places. Yesterday, the UK recorded its highly COVID-related deaths toll since March. Morocco is banning flights to and from the UK following the rise in COVID cases. Authorities in the country have also announced the suspension of flights with Germany and the Netherlands. The moves come into force tomorrow. The Met Commissioner says plainclothes police now must video call uniformed officers when stopping women who are alone. Giving evidence before the London Assembly Police and Crime Committee, Dame Cressida Dick said the Safe Connection initiative will immediately confirm police officers' identity. It comes after PC Wayne Couzens falsely arrested Sarah Everard in March before killing her.
But the onus is on the officer. What was trying to be explained at the press conference was we understand that people may be feeling concerned now, and we, my officers, particularly my male officers, will want to reassure people, and they will go to every length they can to reassure people.
Terrorists who plot to kill multiple people or travel to war zones could face tougher sentences. New guidelines published later will propose a minimum of 14 years in jail. The Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, says the new powers will send a message to those who kill and maim in the name of warped and fanatical ideologies. The move aims to close potential loopholes that allow those convicted of planning attacks to receive shorter sentences. Meanwhile, the House of Commons has been debating the role of social media in providing a platform for terrorism. Well, this is what was said during Prime Minister's questions.
If we're to get serious about stopping violent attacks, we need to stop online spaces being safe spaces for terrorists. We need to ensure that unaccountable, arrogant social media companies take responsibility for their platforms.
What we're doing is ensuring that we crack down on companies that promote illegal and dangerous content, and we'll be toughening up those provisions. But, Mr. Speaker, what we are also going to do is ensure that the online safety bill does complete its stages before this House.
The Queen has cancelled her trip to Northern Ireland for medical reasons. Buckingham Palace confirmed Her Majesty has been advised by doctors to rest. The 95-year-old is said to be in good spirits, although disappointed not to carry out the two-day visit that was scheduled to begin today. Newcastle United's head coach, Steve Bruce, has left his position. In a tweet, the football club confirmed the decision was made by mutual consent. It follows the £305 million takeover of the club by a Saudi consortium, which was completed 2 weeks ago. Mary Berry will be made a Dame Commander by the Prince of Wales for a lifetime of cooking, writing and baking. The leading cookery writer and broadcaster has published more than 50 books during a career spanning over 5 decades. She'll be honoured during a ceremony at Windsor Castle.
I hope I encourage people to bake and to cook because my recipes are fairly simple. Some modern ingredients, but I try to do recipes that the family will say, "Oh, no, haven't you done well?" And it's not only mum that's doing the cooking. The young are cooking and partners are cooking as well.
You're up to date here on GB News. I'll be back with the latest headlines in half an hour. Right now, let's return to the briefing with Tom.
Thanks, Rosie. We've got an absolutely jam-packed show today with so many different stories and interesting guests. But first, let's take a little look at what Prime Minister's questions had to offer, because today saw the first PMQs after a long conference recess. And Keir Starmer decided to ask about how we can prevent future terror attacks. Yet, first of all, there was something else in the chamber that caught my eye. Let's take a look at the Labour benches today. Here are the MPs, all wearing masks. Every single Labour MP. This contrasted with the government benches, where there were a smattering of masks, but it's safe to say most were maskless. Why do I draw attention to this point? Well, less than 3 weeks ago, while Keir Starmer spoke to a packed Labour conference hall, virtually not a single Labour MP was wearing a mask. Look at that contrast. Some may say, look at that hypocrisy. The Labour front bench sitting as close as they do during Prime Minister's questions, but completely maskless. All this less than 3 weeks ago. But surely there were different recommendations at Labour Party conference. Surely these Labour MPs weren't ignoring official advice. Not so. These posters were plastered all over the conference centre. I took that photo myself. They were asking delegates to be respectful of others and wear a face covering. And yes, vaccine passports were initially mandatory at the Labour Party conference, but not after the third day due to, get this, adverse weather conditions. No, the vaccine passports were scrapped. You have to ask the question, why did they ignore their advice at their own conference? And why are they now potentially virtue signalling in Parliament? Could it be that they're simply reflexively doing whatever the opposite of the Tories do? Who's to say?
So will the Prime Minister build on the desire shown by this House on Monday to get things done and commit to bring forward the second reading of the online safety bill by the end of this calendar year? If he does, we'll support it.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman for the spirit in which he has approached this issue, and I echo what he says about the need for cooperation across the House, because the safety of MPs, indeed of all public servants, everybody who engages with the public, is of vital importance, and the online safety bill is of huge importance to, it's one of the most important tools in our armoury.
The Prime Minister and the government could stop this by making it clear that directors of companies are criminally liable for failing to tackle this type of material on their sites. We don't need to delay, so in the collaborative spirit we saw in this House on Monday, will the Prime Minister commit to taking this away, looking at it again, and working with all of us to strengthen his proposed legislation?
We will have criminal sanctions with tough sentences for those who are responsible for allowing this foul content to permeate the internet, Mr. Speaker. But what we hope for also is that no matter how tough the proposals we produce, that the opposition will support it.
There are clearly problems with the government's counter-extremism strategy. Internet users are increasingly likely to come across extremist content online. The government's own independent reviewer has said that there is no evidence that the government's key de-radicalisation programme is effective. That's the government's independent reviewer saying that. And we've seen a spate of lone attack killings with the perpetrator invariably radicalised online.
So I think it would be a fine thing if the opposition would withdraw their opposition to our measures to stop the early release of serious extremist and violent offenders. That's all I'm trying to say. In a collegiate approach, and I'm sure that is what the people of this country would wish to see. But we will continue to do everything that we can to strengthen our counter-terrorism operation and to support all those who are involved in keeping us safe.
If we're to get serious about stopping violent attacks, we need to stop online spaces being safe spaces for terrorists. We need to ensure that unaccountable, arrogant social media companies take responsibility for their platforms. We need to end the delays, get on with the legislation and clean out the cesspit once and for all.
I must say that what I think the whole country and the whole House would certainly want to see, in addition, if I can say this to the right honourable gentleman in a collegiate spirit, in addition, is a commitment by the Labour Party in future to support measures and not to allow the early release of those terrorists and those who are convicted of those offences from prison. And if we could hear that from the Labour Party, I think it would be a fine thing.
And we'll be discussing a lot of that terrorism legislation and what more can be done to combat particularly Islamist terror a little bit later in the show. But for now, yesterday, as we warned you here on this programme, MPs were due to vote on extending the controversial Coronavirus Powers Act for another 6 months. But a division, an actual counted vote in the House of Commons, never took place. Deputy Speaker Rosie Winterton simply waved the legislation through, laughing at some of those who were making their opposition known. Credit must be given to Sir Desmond Swayne for creatively heckling. Let's look at that moment in the House of Commons.
We still have a long way to go. This pandemic is not yet over, and the steps we're proposing would give us the support we need to continue our fight against the virus, whilst restoring yet more of our precious freedoms and the important experience that we really do love. And I commend this motion to the House.
The question is motion number 4 as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. Aye. Could I have the noes again? No. I'm afraid, I fear, the mood of the House is not to have a vote on this. I do understand. I think the honourable gentleman would have to rustle up a few more people to really get the sense that we required a vote when we do. I'm sure they will. So I think the ayes have it, the ayes. Thank you. We now come to the Opposition Day motion in the name of the...
Sterling work, Mr. Swayne, as one colleague there said just at the end of that video. Well, some leading lockdown sceptic MPs have previously warned that the draconian provisions in the law could lead to a dystopian society. But after it was waved through yesterday, many are now saying the Public Health Act, a different piece of legislation appropriately passed in 1984, was the real problem. In any case, little rationality could get through to some of the anti-vax protesters outside Parliament, who had become convinced that the vote was an anti-democratic stitch-up. Things turned ugly yesterday, with Michael Gove being among those disgracefully accosted outside the Home Office. You can see the aggressive behaviour of these agitators surrounding Mr Gove just days after an MP was stabbed to death. The lead agitator here has form after also going after Labour MP Jess Phillips and the journalist Nick Watt. Disgraceful. Similarly disgracefully, just this afternoon, more anti-vaccine protesters erected a noose and gallows on Parliament Square opposite the Palace of Westminster. Again, just days after an MP was killed. Look at that. There are no words to describe these people, but sick, heartless, brutish and moronic come somewhere close. The Metropolitan Police have said they're aware and are making further inquiries. But back to the substance of this issue. The emergency coronavirus legislation was rammed through Parliament in March 2020 at breakneck speed and with little debate. It gave ministers sweeping powers to limit or suspend public gatherings, detain individuals who were expected to be infected, among many other things. It's controversial for good reasons, and the public deserve a level-headed explanation of what happened yesterday. Well, I'm lucky to be joined now by a man who may well be one of the best able to explain what happened. Mark Harper is the chair of the COVID Recovery Group of MPs and joins me now. Welcome to the programme, Mark. This was always going to pass. The Labour Party supporting this piece of legislation, the Conservative Party supporting this piece of legislation, but just for people who don't follow the ins and outs of parliamentary procedure, why didn't it go to a formal vote?
So what happens is if there aren't enough people to oppose a piece of legislation and it's clear to the chair, so in this case to the Deputy Speaker, Rosie Winterton, that it's going to pass, then there won't always be a formal vote. I was clear in the debate, if there'd been a vote, I wouldn't have supported the legislation because I don't think it gives ministers powers, but it doesn't have enough parliamentary scrutiny, enough requirement for ministers to come back to Parliament to make their arguments and to get parliamentary approval at each stage. And that's also, by the way, the problem with the Public Health Act, which you mentioned in your preamble.
No, it does seem that these are pretty sweeping powers, and it's understandable at the start of the pandemic that these were sort of passed very quickly. I think it only spent one day in the House of Commons while everyone was panicked. No one knew how much the House of Commons could actually work during the pandemic. The ministers were given a lot of power. That really doesn't seem like it's so necessary now, particularly as we know just how well our technology can sometimes work in terms of communicating and in terms of scrutinising.
No, I'm very clear about it. If ministers want to take steps now, significant steps, they need to come to Parliament in advance and get Parliament's approval. And we had that debate yesterday about vaccine passports. And I made it very clear that if the government were ever to propose vaccine, which I don't support, pointless, damaging and discriminatory, it should come to Parliament in advance and seek Parliament's approval through a vote before even contemplating such a thing. And actually, I'm pleased that the Secretary of State, Sajid Javid, made it clear that that's the approach that he would want to follow. And I think that's the right approach going forward. Is perfectly reasonable for ministers to propose things, but there needs to be proper scrutiny in Parliament. And that's something, of course, that my group's been doing. We haven't had a lot of support from the Labour Party, who've been absent through most of this process, haven't been challenged, haven't been asking questions that need to be asked. That's the job of MPs after.
Yes, I think when it comes to so many COVID issues, it's actually your group and yourself who could be more accurately described as a leader of the opposition than Sir Keir Starmer. But let's get to the substance of the legislation, because the government did say it had removed vital parts of the Coronavirus Powers Act. There are some of the more draconian bits of this legislation that are no longer on the statute books. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. To be fair, probably I suspect because of a lot of the pressure that we've put on the government. The worst bits of the Act have been removed. So there are no longer powers to detain people indefinitely if they have COVID. A lot of the rules about banning gatherings and shutting down parts of the economy have been removed. And a lot of what's left are about things like allowing sick pay from day one, allowing courts to use electronic links to have trials, and things like that, most of which are not actually that objectionable. So most of the damaging pieces have been removed. But it's worth remembering that all of the lockdowns, all of the massive disruption to society wasn't delivered using the Coronavirus Act. It was all done through the Public Health Act. And that Act remains in place, and all those powers remain available to ministers if they so desire.
And that Act has been on the statute books for many, many decades. Appropriately, as I mentioned earlier, passed in 1984, which has a little Orwellian ring to it. This seems to be the focus of what's going on now. Why were people so focused on the Coronavirus Powers Act when actually it seems that the Public Health Act seems to be the bigger culprit here when we're talking about shutting down vast swathes of our economy and restricting people's individual autonomy?
Well, it's partly because the Coronavirus Act has to be renewed every 6 months. It does provide an opportunity for MPs to debate it and vote on it. The Public Health Act is already in force. And when ministers bring forward proposals under the Public Health Act, they can do them in advance. They can simply pass them by the stroke of a pen, ministerial diktat, if you like. And MPs only get to vote on things retrospectively, government so desires. And it doesn't give MPs a lot of chance to scrutinise them. So one of the things that we've been campaigning for, my colleague Steve Baker has been leading on, is to reform the Public Health Act. So it still gives ministers necessary powers to act in an emergency. but it requires them to come to Parliament, justify what they're doing, and has a lot closer parliamentary control. And I think that's appropriate in a democracy.
That sounds like a really interesting point there. So it could be the case that after this pandemic, if you and Steve Baker and others in the COVID recovery group are successful in reforming the Public Health Act, it could be the case that the draconian powers that the government has accrued during this time and indeed before would be less than before the pandemic. This would be sort of a once-in-a-lifetime event, that we have a crisis and the government may well have fewer powers at the end of it. What are your chances of success here?
Well, honest answer is I don't know, but I think a lot of people have been very uncomfortable with the ability of government to take action without parliamentary control. So I think, look, most people would agree, in an emergency, government needs to be able to act. And I have no problem with ministers having quite strong executive powers, but they have to be properly controlled. So if you take another piece of legislation, the Civil Contingencies Act, measure that's used when there's a national emergency, ministers have a lot of power. They can do almost anything they want, but they have to come back to Parliament very quickly, within days, to get Parliament's approval. They can't just wait for 6 months and come back to Parliament every 6 months. So I think there's a deal here, which is ministers should have the powers to act in an emergency. That's quite proper and right. But they should have to come back to Parliament quickly to secure Parliament's approval on a regular basis to check that those powers are exercised properly. I think that's how the public can rest assured that ministers are making a good case, they're not overstepping things, and they're acting in the interest of the public.
I have to say that sounds incredibly level-headed. It's parliamentary scrutiny, sunset clauses, and indeed those votes in Parliament that are so crucial to make sure that we don't have overbearing government. Mark Harper, thank you so much for your time this afternoon on the briefing on GB News. Really appreciate it. Well, after the break, the Justice Secretary says terrorist planners should get longer in jail. We'll bring you all the details and analysis. But first, here's the weather.
Hello again. Another night of wet and windy weather across parts of the south. There's a Met Office yellow warning in place, some very heavy rain and some gusty conditions. Strongest winds likely over the Channel Isles and northern France. In fact, this area of low pressure has been named by Meteo France, the French meteorological organisation, because we're going to see potentially some damaging winds here. Across southern parts of England, it's more the heavy rain that's cause for concern. Several hours of heavy rain could cause some flooding and some travel disruption, but it will still also be pretty windy along the south coast before that all tends to scoot away before dawn. There's some patchy rain over northern England, sinking southwards, and some showers over northern Scotland that will be falling as snow over the hills, hail and rain to low levels as things turn colder. A much chillier start to Thursday. Quite cloudy to begin with across southern England and South Wales. Some rain across the southwest, but that should clear away. And for many, Thursday's a bright, fine day with quite a bit of blue sky and sunshine. There will be some showers keeping going over northern Scotland, still with snow on the hills, hail and rain to low levels, and some rain showers at times for North Wales, northwest England and Northern Ireland. A colder feel as well, certainly compared to earlier in the week, despite the sunshine, a really chilly wind blowing. That wind will continue to ease down through the afternoon and evening. We'll keep some showers over northern and western Scotland, the odd one for Northern Ireland and northwest England as we head into Friday. And that theme continues into Friday too. Much of southern England, eastern England will stay dry. A drier day for northeast Scotland as well. Still a chilly wind blowing, but that wind will be lighter for many during Friday compared to Thursday. Still a few showers for North Wales, northwest England and western Scotland. Into the weekends, many places start dry and chilly, slowly turning milder with some patchy rain here and there by Sunday.
Join me, Nana Akweer, on Fridays, Saturdays and Sunday afternoons here on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as my panel and I take on some of the top stories hitting the headlines.
You can look up the statistics.
No, you look it up. I hug everyone. We learn from it and try and move on. That's it. Opinion is at the heart of the show. It's a place for open and frank conversation, but without the fear of cancellation. So join me here on GB News on Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoons between 4 and 6 p.m.
Welcome back to the briefing. Now, the UK's parliamentary spending watchdog has begun redacting parts of MPs' expenses in what they claim is a move to protect MP safety following the killing of Sir David Amess. After Sir David was killed at a constituency surgery on Friday, some colleagues raised concerns with the parliamentary regulator IPSA over the amount of information that can be released about claims for travel and venues. Some of these details have been removed from IPSA's website already, with further steps being proposed to withhold certain claims from release, even under Freedom of Information Act requests. One anonymous Labour MP told The Guardian newspaper about the hostility they received about even stationery budgets, suggesting those should be anonymous too, or indeed redacted. Well, joining me to discuss this further is the founder and editor of the Guido Fawkes website, Paul Staines. Welcome to the programme, Paul.
Good afternoon, Tom.
First of all, some people may say that venues, for example, constituency surgeries, that being very, very public on an IPSA register, withdrawing that, withholding that, redacting that, may seem sensible in the light of what's happened.
Well, at first glance, you might think that. But those surgeries are well advertised anyway. That's the whole point of them. And in the British system, and a lot of MPs do support this, we have an open access to MPs and they have to publicise where they are. So I'm not sure what benefit there will be from taking out those details from invoices. And in any event, the expenses data is released after the event. So if you're a terrorist trying to find out where an MP is going to be, there's no point looking in the expense claims to find out. You might as well go on their Twitter page or their website, where they'll probably be publicising where the next surgery is going to be. Now, you might want to stop doing that, and they might consider that people have to apply and then be told where the meeting is. But even in that event, it's still the case that venues would be after the event. And we have to remember the reason that these expenses are put online and available for public scrutiny is because in 2009, we had a massive scandal where hundreds and hundreds of MPs, the majority of MPs, were found to be fiddling their expenses, cheating the taxpayer, and had to repay money. MPs cannot be trusted to mark their own homework. That's why we need the transparency.
Suggesting here that potentially MPs and some scurrilous, curiously anonymous MPs who've been talking to certain newspapers are trying to cover up what they may or may not be doing with their expenses, using this potentially as a pretty awful excuse to remove some of the transparency that's been hard fought for and won over the last decade.
Well, look, when they're buying top-of-the-range Apple AirPods for constituency work, which are initialed and personalised for them, people do wonder, and that just came out just recently. But MPs do not like the scrutiny they get for their first-class tickets on trains and expenditure on top-of-the-range technology, which has dual use. And it's noticeable that sometimes these laptops get ordered just before Christmas, and people do get suspicious. If we don't know what's going on, we won't be able to tell. And at the same time, they're complaining about, and they've always complained about the expense transparency, they're also now wanting to ban privacy for people online. So they want privacy, and they want to take away privacy from people online because they complain that people are rude to them on Twitter.
It's pretty unedifying to see a lot of these sort of long-held hobby horses be raised in the wake just days after the brutal killing of Sir David Amess. I wonder whether it's just these sort of long-held opinions of MPs that they think this is the way things should be, and they're grasping at straws, grasping at pretty awful excuses to try and push their own personal agendas.
Look, in politics, it's a rule that never race the crisis, it's an opportunity. And sorry to be cynical, but I think a lot of MPs are taking the natural sympathy that people have for their situation and the natural anger that a lot of MPs are feeling and trying to get some of their favourite or issues resolved, covering up their expenses, stopping people being rude to them on social media. Those two things haven't just come about by accident. They're irrelevant to the terrorism. The terrorists found the location where he was at from his website. So we don't need to go down that route. and they're just taking advantage of the situation.
Well, it is a fascinating story and one that no doubt we will follow closely, and no doubt you on your Guido Fawkes website will follow closely as well. I know that these sort of stories are your bread and butter, and let's hope that they're not too successful in censoring those public documents. But before we get to all of the other stories in the briefing in the second half of this programme, let's take a look at some of the latest headlines with Rosie Wright.
Good afternoon, I'm Rosie Wright. Let's get you up to date. The Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, is going to hold a news conference this afternoon addressing the rise in daily new COVID cases. The government is under pressure to reintroduce restrictions to avoid a winter crisis. The Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation is calling for Plan B, which includes measures like mandatory face masks in public places. Morocco is banning flights to and from the UK following the rise in COVID cases. Authorities there have also announced a suspension of flights with Germany and the Netherlands. The move comes into force tomorrow. Plain-clothed police officers must now video call uniformed colleagues when stopping women who are alone. The Met Police Commissioner, Dame Cressida Dick, said the Safe Connection initiative, launched today, will immediately verify an officer's identity. It comes after PC Wayne Couzens falsely arrested Sarah Everard in March before killing her. Terrorists who plot to kill multiple people or travel to war zones could face tougher sentences. New guidelines published later today will propose a minimum of 14 years in jail. The Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, says the new powers will send a message to those who kill and maim in the name of warped and fanatical ideologies. The move aims to close potential loopholes that allow those convicted of planning attacks to receive shorter sentences. The Queen has cancelled her trip to Northern Ireland for medical reasons. Buckingham Palace confirmed Her Majesty's been advised by doctors to rest. The 95-year-old is said to be in good spirits, although disappointed not to carry out the two-day visit that was scheduled to begin today. Steve Bruce has left his job as Newcastle United manager. In a tweet, the football club confirmed the decision was made by mutual consent. It follows the club's £305 million takeover by a Saudi consortium, which was completed 2 weeks ago. You're up to date here on GB News. We'll have a full news bulletin for you at 4 o'clock.
Welcome back to the briefing. Now, Steve Bannon, President Donald Trump's former campaign manager, is facing prison after refusing to testify over Capitol Hill riots. Those riots that we saw after the former president lost the election to Joe Biden. A House committee currently investigating the January the 6th attack has accused Bannon of stoking the violence with his statements, opinions, and broadcasts. The Republican vice chair of the House of Representatives, Liz Cheney, meanwhile, claimed yesterday that Bannon's refusal to cooperate suggests that the former president was personally involved in the planning and execution of the so-called insurrection. Let's take a look at that.
Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report to the House the committee's report on a resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find Stephen K. Bannon in contempt of Congress for refusal to comply with a subpoena duly issued by the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. Because he has categorically refused to appear, we have no choice but to seek consequences for Mr. Bannon's failure to comply. Those consequences are not just important for this investigation. They are important for all congressional investigations. Mr. Bannon's and Mr. Trump's privilege arguments do, however, appear to reveal one thing. They suggest that President Trump was personally involved in the planning and execution of January 6th. And this...
Liz Cheney there. Now, many of Trump's supporters, perhaps with good reason, believe the case is politically motivated and agree with Bannon's refusal to cooperate. But remember, with those same Trump supporters, they were the same ones who chanted "lock her up" and called for Hillary to be thrown in jail. So what does the Trump campaign have to say about all of this? Well, I'm very lucky now to be joined by Jason Miller, the former chief spokesman for Donald Trump's presidential campaign, who I believe has only moments ago got off the phone with Steve Bannon. Welcome to the programme. First of all, Jason, why on earth is Steve Bannon not going to appear before the House of Representatives? Surely, if he's an innocent man with nothing to hide, he could happily testify in front of them.
Well, Tom, good afternoon, and it's great to be back on GB News. To make sure that folks in the UK and who are watching the show today understand, the FBI and our Department of Justice have charged some 400 or 500 people with acts connected to January 6th, with what we saw at the Capitol, which was, again, a very troubling day, something we never want to see happen again. However, the four people that they're going after right now, former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, former advisor Dan Scavino, Pentagon official Kash Patel, and then Steve Bannon, not one of those four people have been charged by our actual criminal justice system or even alleged to have committed anything that's illegal. So what's happening here is a very partisan, very anti-Trump committee from Capitol Hill are effectively trying to wage political war as a way to hurt President Trump. Now, if he wasn't talking about running in 2024, none of this would be happening. So again, the four people they're going after had nothing to do with any aspects of violence or chaos as we saw at the Capitol that day. Now, with specific regard to Steve Bannon, President Trump has said that there are separation of powers between the executive branch, where the president is, and the legislative branch, where Congress is. There's a thing called executive privilege in the U.S., where presidents, certain things that happen with discussions with the president, those are protected. Never before in the history of the United States has a current president, i.e. Joe Biden, thrown out that right to a previous president, i.e. President Donald Trump. And that's why this is very clearly a bunch of political gamesmanship. The one other final thing I'd say, Liz Cheney, the Republican who you played the clip of just before, President Trump has endorsed against her in her primary. She's also a Republican. Her approval rating at the moment is only 28%. She's effectively a dead politician walking with regard to her career. So this is much more of a bitter personal retaliation from her.
Some might say that a politician at the end of their career is potentially more truthful, not beholden to anyone, able to speak their actual mind. That could be an argument, could it not?
I don't think so. I think that Cheney is, I think this is really more of just a retaliation. I think that certainly this is the fact that she's no longer going to be representing her state after the end of this next year. I think it's pretty clear what her motivation is, and that's to try to inflict possible damage on President Trump. And I wouldn't be surprised if Cheney even considered running for president herself in 2024. Again, I don't think it'll really go anywhere, but I think that's probably a strong likelihood.
Now, we all saw those remarkable scenes on the 6th of January. We saw the smashed windows. Very tragically, people died. I mean, these were scenes that you would not expect from the sort of lead country of the free world. You would not expect these scenes in a civilized country. Is it not legitimate to explore what happened on that day, and not legitimate to ask questions as to why it took so long for President Trump to call who were his supporters away from what they were doing?
Well, it's very legitimate to ask questions, and I think that's what our FBI and our Department of Justice have been doing ever since January 6th, and that's why they've had such and even in some certain cases, I think they've gone entirely too far with trying to ruin the lives of some people who never entered the Capitol and were merely outside, who were exercising their First Amendment rights in a very peaceful way. I think obviously if people did commit felonies or did commit acts of aggression, there are going to be punishment and things like that. But that's, again, that is for the Justice Department and the FBI, our law enforcement, our judiciary to go and handle. For Congress to then now think that they're going to pop up and magically be Inspector Clouseau or Sherlock Holmes and get to the bottom of something that our entire law enforcement has been unable to do, I think is quite silly.
Now, I just wonder, finally, in this conversation, if this is a political trap that's been set up by some left-leaning Republicans and Democrats in the House of Representatives. Has Steve Bannon not walked exactly into it? Is this not what they wanted to happen? Potentially sending yet another former President Trump advisor to prison after refusing to cooperate with an investigation. Is this not the look that they wanted, the PR victory that they were after?
That's a good point. I think that it can cut both ways. I think this is largely a base play for the Democrats, who they know that their base is very frustrated and unhappy with what's happening with Joe Biden right now. Literally record-setting low approval numbers, disastrous withdrawal of Afghanistan, hyperinflation here at home, supply chain issues. People are wondering if they're going to be toys for Christmas, for crying out loud. So this makes the Democratic base happy, but I do think this cuts against them with the general public that views this as another Russia type witch hunt. Then we had impeachment 1. Then we had impeachment 2. Now we're on to this. And again, it's all, I think most voters in the U.S. are pretty sophisticated and know this is all about trying to damage President Trump for 2024.
Now, just finally, you were an official spokesman, I think the chief spokesman of the 2016 Donald Trump presidential campaign. You're someone who's worked with Donald Trump. What is your reading of the meter in terms of how likely it is that President Trump will properly mount a successful run again next time round?
Another great question. As someone who, again, I was the chief spokesperson for his 2016 race, and then I was his senior advisor for the 2020 presidential election, and I worked with him through the first 4 or 5 months of his post-presidency. While no formal or official decision has been made yet, I fully expect President Trump to run again in 2024, but I don't think it's going to be against Joe Biden. I think it'll most likely be against Kamala Harris, who's currently the vice president, or Gavin Newsom, who is the governor of California. I think ultimately it's Trump versus Newsom in the general election. I think President Trump beats him as the blowback and the pushback against the statist approach, everything from COVID to big government. It gets a big pushback from the American public. I think people are tired of the overreach from the wokest left.
Well, it is a really, really interesting story. I know that many people in this country are fascinated by what happens in America. It affects the whole world, and no doubt we'll be returning to this story before too long. Jason Miller, thank you very much for joining us on The Briefing on GB News this afternoon. Now, ministers have been talking tough on terror. Published proposals today say that those who conspire to commit terror on a mass scale will face longer prison terms under reformed sentencing guidelines. Justice Secretary Dominic Raab has argued that the new advice for judges to hand down sentences of a minimum of 14 years would send a stronger message to those who plot to kill and maim in the name of warped and fanatical ideologies. The Ministry of Justice, the Justice's move comes as police continue to question the motives around the murder of Tory MP Sir David Amess last week. The suspect has been detained under the Terrorism Act. Well, joining us now to discuss this proposal and the wider context is Dr. Alan Mendoza, co-founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society. Dr. Mendoza, welcome to the programme. Thank you very much for joining us. We hear a lot of tough talk from the government around events like these. I remember the speeches that Prime Minister Theresa May made around the attacks in 2017 and the speeches that followed attacks in 2019 as well. Will this actually change anything?
Well, I think the sentencing guidelines part of this sort of discussion will change something in the sense that obviously those who are found guilty of certain crimes or those who will now be prosecutable for certain crimes in a way they might not have been before will now either serve longer sentences or will, of course, have the capacity to be tried for the extension of capability. So on that basis, of course, this will make some difference. I mean, it was interesting you read out the comment that this will deter people. I don't think it will. I mean, the reality is, unfortunately, these people are ideologically committed. But the key thing is that it will keep them locked up for longer and extend the numbers of people, of course, who can be locked up for playing a part in a terrorist incident. And that clearly is good news for the British people.
Absolutely. It does seem that so often in accounts of whether it's terrorism or indeed other crimes, it's people who've been released from prison. Why have we been relatively soft touch in this area up until now?
Well, I'd like to say it's because of obviously British traditions of fair play and you've served your sentence and on you go. But the reality is, of course, we were letting people out of many sort of offences about halfway through their sentences. Now, that changed a couple of years ago, of course, and that's been extended. But we were just being too lax in our prison service on people and trusting, of course, that they'd been de-radicalised. What we need to understand is that these people we're talking about, particularly in these sentences and the idea of extreme preachers in particular, these are ideological criminals. They are not opportunists. They are not people who have just gone wrong in one instant. They are people who have consciously gone wrong for a long period of time, and and their beliefs are deeply ingrained. And as a result, it is very difficult to shake those beliefs out of them, which explains, as you say, the level of recidivism in the crimes. And also, of course, it means that they are highly motivated to lie and pretend that they are de-radicalised when in fact they're not. So on that basis, longer sentences can only be a good thing from the safety point of view.
And of course, surrounding all of this is the culture, is the idea that there is an insidious ideology within this country, within far too many people of this country, who loathe the way that our free, open and democratic institutions run. To what extent have there been failures here in this particular case with the PREVENT programme, to which, of course, the accused man was referred, and it seemed to not go anywhere? Do we need to reform PREVENT?
Well, look, here's a very complicated case. We're still uncovering the details of what exactly happened in his PREVENT referral and why it didn't go further. We need to obviously understand why it was decided that he shouldn't proceed down a de-radicalisation path. And indeed, of course, what happened in the interim period, that was many years ago. What was he doing in the meantime? Was he picked up at all? So all those questions need to be looked at, and they do, of course, play into what you said, which is the need to look at reform of PREVENT, or at least seeing what's gone wrong and can be put right. And obviously, a couple of those things are, firstly, it does appear that there is a chilling effect around the idea of radical Muslim referrals in particular, because over the last few years, we've had people being told repeatedly that the PREVENT programme is discriminatory against Muslims, and it's wrong to refer people of faith to these panels. Well, it turns out that may well have had an impact on people's willingness to A, refer them, and B, to move them up the chain. If that is the case, then Prevent is not doing its job properly. We have to look at why that situation has evolved and what can be done about it. Clearly, the obvious point is to end political correctness, to look at all extremism, whether it is far right, far left, radical Islam, under the same light, and not say that one form of extremism is sort of, better than the other, and we will therefore tackle only this one, whereas we'll give a free pass there. That is, I'm afraid, the answer that would give you more terrorist attacks of this kind.
Well, Dr. Alan Mendoza, really fascinating conversation. I know it's one that will run and run as more details are uncovered about this horrendous case, but thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing this afternoon on GB News. Now, in the run-up to COP26, that climate conference in Glasgow, the government yesterday laid down a series of green strategies. Boris Johnson is calling it the most comprehensive green strategy in the Western world. But is it really? The net zero strategy introduced to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, or the heat and building strategy that will incentivise homeowners to replace their current boiler to lower carbon heating systems. They're just two of the 4 strategies that were announced. But what does this mean? Is the plan ambitious enough, and how much will it cost taxpayers? Well, joining me to discuss this is Chris Venables, Head of Policy at the Green Alliance. Thank you so much for joining us on GB News. Firstly, are you at the Green Alliance broadly welcoming of what the government's announced this week?
Thanks, Tom, and good to be with you. We've been waiting for this strategy for the best part of a year. It sets out clearly how the government will meet its climate targets. It sets out how we're going to kind of unleash investment in jobs and industries across the UK, and it marks a good bit of progress ahead of COP26. There's always more to do, but it's a good start, and I think it's good for consumers, it's good for the environment, and it's good for the UK.
Now, a lot of people won't understand exactly what COP26 is. I didn't know that it stood for Congress of Parties, or the Congress of the Parties, until very recently. It's the 26th gathering of international of countries around the world to try and achieve things. The last one was in Madrid in 2019, didn't really achieve all that much. The two that people will have heard of are Paris and Kyoto. In your view, will Glasgow be a Paris and a Kyoto, or will it be a Madrid?
I think the jury's out. I think these things often go kind of right down to the wire, but it's shaping up. The two big issues on the table are we going to have our climate targets that keep warming to 1.5 degrees, and are we going to have the finance to close the gap and support countries in the global south kind of make this change? We're still waiting on some big promises, in particular China. But I think we've seen the UK really step up. We've seen Alok Sharma do a really good job. And I think we've got, a week and a bit now just to kind of close the gap. So I'm hopeful, but I think it's not just on the UK, it's on the rest of the world, on the big emitters to make promises and to make this work.
Well, I'm really sorry. We've run up at the end of the programme. We'll have to have you back to explore this in more detail. But thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing. Up next, it's the afternoon agenda with Patrick Christie's. But for now, I'll leave you with these messages.
Hello again. Another night of wet and windy weather across parts of the south. There's a Met Office yellow warning in place, some very heavy rain and some gusty conditions. Strongest winds likely over the Channel Isles and northern France. In fact, this area of low pressure has been named by Météo France, the French meteorological organisation, because we're going to see potentially some damaging winds here. Across southern parts of England, it's more the heavy rain that's cause for concern. Several hours of heavy rain could cause some flooding and some travel disruption, but it will still also be pretty windy along the south coast before that all tends to scoot away before dawn. There's some patchy rain over northern England, sinking southwards, and some showers over northern Scotland that will be falling as snow over the hills, hail and rain to low levels as things turn colder. A much chillier start to Thursday. Quite cloudy to begin with across southern England and South Wales. Some rain across the southwest, but that should clear away. And for many, Thursday's a bright, fine day with quite a bit of blue sky and sunshine. There will be some showers keeping going over northern Scotland, still with snow on the hills, hail and rain to low levels, and some rain showers at times for North Wales, Northwest England and Northern Ireland. A colder feel as well, certainly compared to earlier in the week, despite the sunshine, a really chilly wind blowing. That wind will continue to ease down through the afternoon and evening. We'll keep some showers over northern and western Scotland, the odd one for Northern Ireland and northwest England as we head into Friday. And that theme continues into Friday too. Much of southern England, eastern England will stay dry. A drier day for northeast Scotland as well. Still a chilly wind blowing, but that wind will be lighter for many during Friday compared to Thursday. Still a few showers for North Wales, northwest England and western Scotland. Into the weekends, many places start dry and chilly, slowly turning milder with some patchy rain here and there by Sunday.
I'm Neil Oliver. You can join me live every Saturday evening for opinions and discussions about the week's top stories. There's also a smattering of history and archaeology and features that define our great British Isles. You'll hear my thoughts unfiltered, as well as those of my guests, and we don't always agree. And we want to hear from you too. Neil Oliver Live, Saturdays from 7 on GB News.
Sometimes it's nice to own something real that you can hold in your hand and one day pass on to your loved ones. This free guide from Direct Bullion told me everything I needed to know so I could start my own collection of gold coins and bullion bars. All the gold they sell is VAT free, and their specialists are on hand to guide and support their customers. For your free Direct Bullion guide to buying gold, call 0800 055 7050.
Hey, you know that warm feeling you get when you help someone in need?
SOS Emotional Health Charity needs volunteers like you to support people who are struggling with their feelings.
If you're compassionate and over 18 and have got a little free time, you can join SOS as a phone or email support volunteer giving kindness and time.
Training, ongoing development and support will be provided.
Apply to join the SOS family today and turn your spare minutes into another person's lifeline.
Wouldn't life be so much easier if you could control your blinds at the touch of a button? With Ultra Smart Blinds from Appeal, there's no chains, cords or wiring, because these stylish blinds are driven by a rechargeable power pack. New Ultra Smart Blinds from Appeal, the intelligent solution for home shading.
Did you know that atrial fibrillation increases risk of stroke by 5 times? If you have AF, it's easy to check on your heart from home with KardioMobile.
It's accurate, it's reliable, and it makes me feel reassured.
You can take an ECG in just 30 seconds, anytime, anywhere. KardioMobile is the CE-marked personal ECG device that can detect atrial fibrillation and other common arrhythmias using your smartphone.
You can take it anywhere with you, and it's so easy to take a reading.
Find out more at kardiomobile.co.uk.
Hello everybody and welcome to the Afternoon Agenda with me, Patrick Christie, still in for Alex Phillips, who is again still missing. If anyone can get in touch with us, let us know where she is, then please do indeed do that. But anyway, this show is all about expert opinion, your opinion, and of course a little bit of mine as well. So with that in mind, today on the Afternoon Agenda, vaccine immunity is waning apparently as we head towards a potential winter COVID surge, and with it a winter of discontent. Is the booster programme up to scratch, and are further restrictions the answer? Well, we'll ask the experts. The female students planning nightclub boycotts over what they call an epidemic of drink spiking. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to see this story yet because it broke today, but goodness me, absolutely harrowing stuff. We'll be speaking to one of the organisers of said boycott. Plus, after a series of organisations, including government departments, pull out of the charity's Champions programme, today, ladies and gentlemen, we need to talk about Stonewall. Does the charity's influence reach too far? That's the agenda for the next hour. But let me know what's on yours. GB Views at gbnews.uk. Tweet me at GBNews. But first, it's time for the latest headlines.
Hello, I'm Polly Middlehurst. This is your news at 4 o'clock. The Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, is due to hold a news conference this afternoon addressing the rise in COVID cases across the UK. The government's now under pressure to reintroduce restrictions to avoid a winter crisis. The Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation is calling for a Plan B which includes measures like mandatory face masks in public places once again. Yesterday, the UK recorded its highest daily COVID-related deaths since March. Morocco's banning flights to and from the UK following the rise in COVID cases. The move officially comes into force tomorrow. Moroccan